Okay.
Looks like the recording is going. Welcome, everyone. My name's Christy Nowak. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the chair of the ACRL IS Virtual Engagement Committee. I'd like to welcome you to the 2020 Current Issues panel discussion, which is titled Privacy Literacy Reboot, Grounding Practice and Theory. Before I hand it over to the moderators, I just wanted to mention a few tech things, and you might have heard these if you've been here for a few minutes. But since this is a webinar format, you won't be able to use your mic or your camera, but we very much encourage you to participate by chat. If you want to introduce yourself, if you have any issues, questions, comments, resources you want to share. We will also be using the Q&A feature, and we encourage you to use that if you want to ask a question that you want to make sure that the panelists and moderators see, because sometimes things do get lost in the chat. So with that said, I'm very excited to hand it over to our moderators. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And this is Alex Chisholm speaking right now. Before we get started, Sarah and I just wanted to make sure that we thanked the ACRL Instruction Section Virtual Engagement Committee for inviting us to have this panel and for preparing everything for us. And that includes Christy Nowak, Lisa Campbell, and Aaron Durham. We also wanted to thank Lois Sharp, the ALA Program Director, for having us. So just to introduce ourselves, my name is Alex Chisholm. As I mentioned, I am a reference and instruction librarian at Penn State Berks, and I'm going to turn over the mic to my colleague and collaborator, Sarah, to introduce herself.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Sarah Hartman-Caverly, and I'm a fellow reference and instruction librarian at Penn State Berks.
All right, and I also wanted to give us an opportunity to meet our panelists who are wonderful and are going to be sharing their expertise and experience with us today. We have Symphony Bruce, who I'm going to allow to unmute and introduce herself.
Hi, folks. Thank you for having me. I'm Symphony Bruce. I'm a member of the Research, Teaching, and Learning Department at American University, and right now working as their interim business librarian. Super happy to be here.
Okay, great. And our second panelist, Claire Lobdell.
Hi there, I'm Claire Lobdell. I'm the distance education librarian and archivist at Greenfield Community College in Western Massachusetts.
And our final panelist, Andrew Wesolek.
Hi, I'm Andy Wesolek. I'm the Director of Digital Scholarship and Communications based in the libraries at Vanderbilt University, and overjoyed to be here. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. So just to give everybody a roadmap for what we're going to be doing over the next hour, we are going to give a brief overview of the state of privacy literacy in academic library instruction. And then Sarah and I will be sharing a little bit about our approach to privacy literacy. And then we'll move into the panel discussion, which will take up the bulk of our session today. And finally, if time permits, we will have a little bit of a participant discussion with all of you. Thank you for attending. And we'll, of course, be leaving time to answer questions. So thank you for joining us. Sarah's going to be dropping a link into the chat for our poll everywhere, but we always like to read the temperature of the room, so to speak. So we wanted to ask what brought you to this privacy literacy discussion today. So you can go ahead, and if you open up that link, you should be able to answer our All right, great. I will leave this open for a few more seconds, but it looks like the majority of people are interested in learning about privacy literacy instruction. So yay, wonderful. We're very passionate about this topic, and we're so excited to be sharing all of our experiences with all of you. And it seems like some people are already delivering privacy literacy instruction, and that is fabulous. We're excited to learn from you as well. We want to hear all about it. Hopefully we'll have time to discuss. So thank you for responding to our poll. So just to give you a little bit of a brief overview of the state of privacy literacy, Sarah and I began collaborating about 2.5 years ago. We were developing student learning experiences, but that led to a scholarly collaboration as well. So we want to just share some relevant data from some of our previous studies before we jump into our approach. As I mentioned, this will be very brief, but there are some surveys that were done previously, and they were a little bit illuminating to us. We wanted to share that data. So one is from 2014, and that was surveying all librarians from the ALA. So that was K through 12, public and academic. But it showed that 75% of respondents believed that the library should be playing a role in educating about privacy. Only 13% were indicating that they had hosted or organized an event at their library. The follow-up study was in 2018, and that was done by some Canadian academic librarians. And they found that 55% of their respondents had attended professional development on privacy-related topics. However, only 19% of them worked at a library that was hosting these educational opportunities for students. So this shows that there's an interest in privacy literacy, but not necessarily a lot of execution going on. And Sarah and I were interested in learning why that is. So we conducted a survey in the spring of 2019. We had 118 submissions, 82 that were completed to the end. But when we asked about what privacy literacy topics librarians were including in their instruction, we just wanted to call out that about 35% of our respondents stated that they did not include privacy literacy topics in any of their instruction, which we thought was a pretty significant number. When we asked about professional satisfaction in their library's approach to privacy literacy instruction, 54% were extremely or somewhat dissatisfied, which is a pretty significant amount. 37% were kind of neutral. They were neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, and only 9% were extremely or somewhat satisfied. So people obviously think this is important and don't necessarily think we're doing enough. And finally, the last little tidbit that we wanted to share from our survey, we were curious about the factors that influence the lack of delivery or dissatisfaction with privacy literacy instruction. And we found very fascinating things with this question. So 80% of librarians felt that they did not have enough instructional time to dedicate to these privacy topics. 16% did not feel like they had time to develop privacy literacy activities or lesson plans. And 22% did not believe that they had the expertise to be teaching about privacy. All of those are significant to us, and time seemed to be a big factor. But the one that we thought was the most fascinating data point was that nobody said that another campus department or entity was teaching about privacy. So we really feel like there's a gap here in coverage in higher education, and it's a role that that academic librarians can easily be filling. And so we wanted to call out one of our recommended readings that we had given prior to this session. And this is coming from the fabulous Data Doubles team. This is from their article In Their Own Words. And essentially this is a direct quote from a student that they interviewed. And basically it's just saying that students trust the library as an institution and an organization. Facebook, different social media companies, corporate entities, they don't expect any sort of privacy from these companies, but they do expect it from us, and they trust us. And that's a big responsibility, and we feel like we need to earn and deserve that trust as librarians and library professionals. So now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to briefly talk about our approach to privacy literacy.
Thanks, Alex. So we'll share a little bit with you about what we're doing as part of our Digital Shred collaboration at Penn State Berks. So in addition to solving the problem that no other campus unit is teaching about privacy, we also noticed in the literature and in some of our own experiences that there's more and less effective ways to talk about privacy literacy. So this excerpt is from another one of the recommended readings from the digest, the Hagendorf article, where he talks about how the problem with privacy instruction right now is that it focuses a lot on front-end features and technological settings and not on some of the additional dispositional and metacognitive skills that students and just people need in order to really keep tabs on what's going on behind the scenes. So they need to be able to consider the voluntariness of their information disclosures, become aware of hidden data collection mechanisms, and also make sure that there's more going on than just, setting privacy settings or leaving the default settings. So that's informed a lot of our work, and we approached our definition of privacy literacy with that critical mindset in mind. So Alex and I in our scholarship define privacy literacy as a suite of knowledge, behaviors, and critical dispositions regarding the information constructs of selfhood expressive activities, and relationships. And we say it's related to information literacy and addresses a lot of those metaphysical and social dynamics of information. In the course of our research, we've also developed this conceptual framework for privacy, which we call the 6 private I's. We'll talk about how we focus a lot on the positive case for privacy, and we come at it from that kind of positive sum philosophy rather than really a techno-solutionist philosophy. But essentially through the course of our reading and teaching and working with students, we've identified these 6 areas where privacy plays a positive role in the human experience. That's in your identity, your intellectual activity, your bodily and contextual integrity, your intimacy or ability to have intimate relationships, and then at the outermost sphere of your privacy, your ability to freely decide when and with whom to socially interact, and when to voluntarily withdraw into seclusion and isolation. Again, our guiding principles to how we approach privacy literacy, we want to have a really holistic approach, which is positive case and positive sum, not techno-solutionist. And we approach privacy essentially as a value system or a culture rather than as a technology. We're very aware of the issue of the control paradox. This is over-promising to students their ability to control their own information capture and reuse. And so we focus a lot more on context than on method. The why of why privacy matters and how we want to protect it, rather than the exact precise mechanisms for how to go about protecting it. And of course, those mechanisms will change because it's a cat and mouse game. Finally, we do a lot of listening to and learning from our own students. They bring their own lived experiences, values, and knowledge to all of our workshops. So those 4 workshops are now on the screen for you. We always start with the privacy workshop, which is integrated into the first-year seminar program at Penn State Berks. We've delivered that workshop to about 30 first-year seminar sessions, reaching more than 600 students over the course of the past 2.5 years. We address privacy issues in the present moment. So we're using things like click, click, click so that students can see exactly how browsers are capturing behavioral data about them in real time. The other 3 workshops that we deliver scaffold from the privacy workshop, and we've started to deliver them as a suite together in October in honor of National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Digital leadership really looks at privacy issues as it relates to students' aspirations and in Shoshana Zuboff's words, their right to a future tense. So we talk about how their online behaviors now can impact their futures and make them a little bit more aware about that. Digital Shred then inverts that paradigm and looks at their behaviors in the past and their digital exhaust and gives them some frameworks, tools, and techniques to perhaps clean up their data double and have a plan for auditing their data behaviors and capture going forward. And then digital wellness takes that really, across the lifespan approach to looking at privacy in the past, present, and future, and critically examines our relationship to technology and how it can be both a positive impact on our well-being as well as a negative impact on our well-being. So again, we focus on really giving students critical thinking tools and frameworks to make informed decisions rather than having prescriptions about how they should address technology and privacy. So these last few student artifacts are examples from our workshops. This is the personal data plan. That's the takeaway from the first privacy workshop. The next artifact is the wellness wheel, which they develop in the course of the digital wellness session. And this digital shred damage assessment they develop in the digital shred session. And this is based on a real intelligence community artifact called a damage assessment. If you're interested in looking at any of these teaching materials, as well as case studies and even scholarship, you can find all of this indexed on our Digital Shred Privacy Literacy Toolkit. And I'm sure Alex is dropping that link in the chat for you right now. And if you have ideas for additions to the toolkit, please feel free to let us know. We actively curate this on a day-to-day basis. So I'll pass the mic back to Alex, who's going to moderate the discussion with our panelists.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So now we're going to get into the meat of this session, and we're going to be learning all sorts of insights from our great panelists. So moving into that, we're going to start off with Symphony. What are your rationales for teaching privacy literacy?
Thank you for this question. My rationale for teaching privacy literacy is was a reaction to realizing there was so much information that I didn't know. And realizing that our institutions that we work for are not going to do the right thing to explain how student data is collected with the use of programs and tech and software and third party, this, that, and the other. We know that our institutions are primarily concerned with compliancy. And that's not what I was interested in. But this came out of actually working in the K-12 setting. I was a high school English language arts teacher for quite a few years. My district was a Google district, and we were in the process of doing a one-to-one program for all of our students where they would all get Chromebooks. And there wasn't much guidance given to parents and students about what they should and shouldn't do with their district issued device, aside from don't do illegal activity and don't search for porn. They weren't really given much else. And I felt the need as students were, living their lives with this technology to make sure that they knew perhaps what they should and shouldn't do with it. The fact that there were filters, content filters, that their emails were completely visible, to folks in the background for our district. And then also becoming aware of the equity issues of these kinds of technologies. My students whose family had means could afford to have personal devices, while my students whose families had financial difficulties, this Chromebook was often the only piece of technology in their homes. So their parents were using those things, their siblings were probably using it. But I didn't have the language to really describe to students what was happening in the background and what they could do about it, if anything. And so, yeah, my rationale is to be transparent and honest now with my college students about the technology that they're interacting with, and what data they're essentially giving up in exchange for the use of those items.
Thank you so much, Symphony. And I want to touch base with Andy and see if you have anything to add about your rationales.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. So I want to first start off by saying that I tend to come to this more from a theoretical side. So I really appreciate your practical application there, Symphony. And if you ever are able to get the language to talk about this in an effective way, please let me know, because I don't have it. So I think my rationale is I think most importantly, I think that privacy and freedom from surveillance are really necessary conditions for intellectual freedom. We need private places in order to cultivate new ideas, and freedom from surveillance in order to kind of engage with radical or even potentially subversive ideas. And I think, honestly, both are necessary conditions for our dignity as persons as well. And I also just find privacy to be a super interesting concept. I'm so glad that you shared that Padlet at the beginning, and I hope folks have a chance to take a look at that, because it illustrates this point that we tend to agree that privacy is important, but we can never quite define what exactly it is. So in her history of modern privacy in America, The Known Citizen, Sarah Igo refers to it as an endlessly elastic term, which I love because it takes on social, political, historical, and even religious connotations. And I just find it fascinating that so many of us are here today to learn more about privacy. Yet again, looking at the Padlet, I think we would probably have trouble coming to consensus on what it is we're even here to talk about, which I just find fascinating. And professionally, I come from a scholarly communications background with an emphasis on advocating for and helping to facilitate the production of open and multimodal research in both research outputs and educational resources. And I think as research and education becomes increasingly open, our communities will continue to shift their information seeking practices outside of the kind of walled garden of library catalogs, and even more towards search engines, social media, et cetera. And I just think we as librarians would do well to kind of critically examine the information economies that support those tools and their corresponding privacy implications.
All right, thank you, Andy. And thank you for bringing us back to the Padlet. I forgot at the beginning, but yes, that is a very interesting exercise that we do in our privacy workshop with all of our students. And we love to learn about all of their conceptions of privacy. So if you have time to go back and review it, it is pretty cool to see everyone's responses. All right, so I'm going to go back to Symphony for our second question. What is your philosophy about privacy literacy instruction, and how do you approach it?
Thank you for this question as well. And I think that I can see there's a question in the chat, which I think my response will kind of lead to a bit. I first and foremost think that privacy literacy is information literacy. And mostly because our information access is increasingly mediated by third parties who learn about us as individuals and as groups through the data collection and the use of those products. And obviously information literacy is about a lot more than search and retrieval. But information dissemination and access are obvious areas for discussion, and how our data is collected through the use of those products in order to do the research and to find the information we're looking for is really a perfect fit. And that's usually the way that I go about sort of intertwining privacy literacy into my own instruction, is that I just simply try to find the pockets where opening the discussion might seem to fit. So if I'm going to run a workshop, for example, on I don't know, advanced search engine and sort of searching the open internet, then we're also going to talk about, why the use of Google is seemingly free. We're going to talk about how Google makes its money. We're going to talk about alternatives and different search engines and the benefits and negatives to using any of them, which is mostly what I've been trying to do. My second lens is through harm reduction. A lot of the times students will say, all of this information about me already exists. And so we try to approach that with, there's still so much more of you that could be accessed. So we can begin to narrow and bring it in and rein it in and to have those conversations. And then probably my last approach is a community approach, that when we are healthier in our own digital behaviors and we advocate for a more private digital and physical world, we protect ourselves, but also our loved ones and our community. And that really rings positive, I think, for students to be like, oh yeah, I have people in my family that I would like to protect. And these conversations help with that. So I think it's useful for students to know that they can make little changes. I think that discussion is just helpful, and squeezing it in when you can, especially if you don't have the capacity to completely redo your instruction or to roll out an entire workshop series.
Great, thank you, Symphony. And now I'm going to turn to Claire and ask the same question.
Thank you. Yeah, so like Symphony, a big part of my philosophy about privacy instruction has to do with the concept of harm reduction. Actually, both Symphony and I went through the Library Freedom Institute, which is a wonderful program, and that's one of the guiding philosophies of LFI, which is well, for me, it was 6 months. I think there's like a 4-month version now, but anyways, it's a program that teaches privacy and anti-surveillance skills and information to all sorts of different types of librarians. And that concept of harm reduction comes out of the public health field. So helping people find ways to use technologies in a way that's safer for them. I think another part of my philosophy of privacy instruction goes back to what Alex and Sarah showed about the personal data plan. In other contexts, people call that a threat model, but it's getting a sense of like what what your own personal risks and what your own personal vulnerabilities are, and those are different for different people depending on the contexts of their lives. When I'm teaching privacy workshops, I try to frame it around a few different questions. So like one of those is getting people to think about, if I'm getting this thing for free, where is the transaction that's paying for it? Another one of those big questions is, can this data that I'm giving up or this technology be used in ways other than how it's advertised? Another one is, does my personal safety depend on the good intentions of someone else? So like this is the concept of privacy by policy versus privacy by design. Like, is my stuff encrypted, or is it just like in a database somewhere and I have to hope that like this stuff sitting in an unencrypted database is being accessed by good folks? And then finally, does this data collection or technology disproportionately harm specific demographics? And like, spoiler alert, the answer to that is oftentimes yes, in really toxic ways. But then also, I try to always like end on kind of a high note, like a, you know, like Alex and Sarah were talking about, thinking about, you know, the future you want to live in, the ways that you can, you know, design your life in a way and interact with technology in a way that is empowering for you and gives you like the knowledge to protect yourself and protect the people whose privacy depends on your privacy.
Thank you, Claire. And yes, privacy is a team sport, right? We're often protecting others when we protect ourselves. All right, so I'm going to stay with Claire with this next question. But what has been the student response to privacy literacy instruction?
Sure, yeah, thank you. So there's one activity that I've done a lot with a few different groups that I call the risks and rewards of convenience. It's part of a larger lesson plan that's on the framework sandbox if anyone is interested. But it's one where I sometimes divide the class into like a pro team and a con team, and they're sort of like set up like a debate. And I'll give them an example of something that is advertised as a convenience, like the ability to, you know, track the location of your family members so you know where they are. And so we talk about where people have seen that and the ways that that could be a good thing and the ways that that could harm people and how that's been used. And we'll do a few different rounds of that. And it's quite interesting how, you know, students they really respond to this. Like, for example, I've done this activity with high school students. Here at my community college, we have a lot of dual enrolled high school students. And, you know, a lot of their families use something called Life 360, Life 360, I think, which is like a kind of stalkerware app that people install on their kids' phones. Or another example is like technology, sort of like Symphony was talking about, that's installed on student Chromebooks that will alert, you know, your school if you use like trigger words of any sort. And so, you know, I try to give examples that people may have encountered in their real life, and then also like things that maybe are less intense, but like seeing ads for things that you've, you know, browsed in online shopping, you know, having those ads follow you around the internet. And so we talk about those. People talk about where they've seen them, what they think about them, and then we talk about ways to like minimize those things happening. And students have been really into it. They have a ton of questions. You know, I've had students come up to me afterwards, like months afterwards. Someone was like, she's like, I always check now to see if websites have like HTTPS at the beginning of them, or like little things like that, which felt good. And the other thing I would say is that a lot of times, or not a lot of times, but several times I've had students, you know, disclose being, you know, the ways that they have been stalked and harassed using various technologies. You know, that our students are experiencing the real world harms of these, of surveillance technologies, and that definitely comes up.
Okay, thank you. And Andy, did you want to share any of the student response from any of your privacy literacy instruction?
Sure. So our student response has been like surprisingly positive. I'll admit to being under the false impression that privacy is dead among the younger cohorts, but they've been much more interested than I suspected. And I'll also say that like at Vanderbilt, we're relatively early on in our process of developing kind of privacy literacy instruction. So we did a kickoff event to start these conversations, gosh, about a year and a half ago, where we invited Allison Macrina, who's the director of Library Freedom Institute, and I believe is on this call, to come in and deliver a talk to us about the importance of privacy. And then we held a privacy fair in which students and staff kind of staffed tables in which they taught, a particular technology or a technique or a skill related to privacy. So people could bring their laptops and their smartphones and go from table to table and kind of clean up their security settings, et cetera. So that was really successful. And then following that, we've run 2 fellowships for undergraduate students. Myself and my amazing colleagues, Melissa Mallon and Bobby Smiley, ran one last semester on the ethics of information that focused quite a bit on privacy. And then this semester, specifically on privacy, surveillance, and intellectual freedom. And those 2 fellowships were among the most popular of the fellowships offered by the libraries in that period of time. And for me, it's been most fascinating to see the different angles from which students approach this topic. So like some of our students are super interested in like the technology and techno-solutionism. And they're like interested in building privacy tools with Raspberry Pis or learning steganography or that kind of thing. But others are more interested in the cultural logics of surveillance and thinking about the history of privacy as a concept. And then we have others that really approach it from a very strong social justice orientation. And so it's just been really kind of inspiring to see people interested in students interested in this concept from a variety of different angles. And I think honestly, it's been kind of one of the most professionally inspiring things that I've been involved in for a few years now.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. And our experiences mirror yours, that students do care about privacy. Privacy is not dead. I think we have some data doubles people here, and we linked in our readings to a DLF webinar where they shared some forthcoming research that helped debunk that students do in fact care deeply about privacy. And that's certainly been Sarah's and my experience. So thank you for sharing all that rich stuff. All right. So I'm going to turn back to Symphony for our next question. And this is for everybody here that is not maybe yet delved into privacy literacy instruction or perhaps is looking to start. But what advice would you offer a librarian who is in the early stages of privacy literacy instruction?
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate being able to answer this question because up until 2 years ago, I would have considered myself a complete privacy novice. Someone who just realized that there were things I needed to know, but I didn't know how to know them. And I'm super thankful for my participation in Library Freedom Institute for giving me the language to talk about privacy. That was the biggest thing that I had to do, was to get comfortable talking privacy and to do it in a way that felt really natural for me, because I'm not like a tech person. I didn't want to talk about privacy only through technologies. And so I think that would be like the first piece of advice that I would offer, is that as a person learns new things, to begin to feel comfortable getting that knowledge out of your mouth and talking to other people about it. I often tell people that as I learned new things during Library Freedom, for example, I would regurgitate it to my partner. And he learned a whole lot over the course of 6 months, because I had to get myself used to saying things and to talking about privacy as a concept and as behaviors and as actions. So I think that would be the first thing that I would suggest is reading and talking. And then my second piece of advice to all instructors, period, no matter what, is to not recreate the wheel. That is rule number 1 for instructors. There are so many really great materials that already exist out there, like the ones that Alex and Sarah have introduced to us today. And we should use those things. We should remix those things. We should ask for permission to use those things to help us get more comfortable until we want to be as creative as we have the capacity to do so.
Thank you, Symphony. And Andy, would you like to offer any additional advice?
Can I just say ditto? I think I think that's fantastic advice, and I would reiterate it. I would add two little bits to it. I think first is again, make use of those resources like Digital Shred that we talked about today and the Library Freedom Institute. Also, just reach out to your colleagues. I think you probably are getting the sense that those of us on the call are like deeply passionate about this topic. And if you, like, for example, were to email me and ask me a question about privacy, I may talk your ear off for like an hour about it. Like I might give you more than you want, but reach out to your colleagues because I think that, you know, we'd always be happy to share information. And I think the only other bit that I would add is, you know, think about starting a reading group locally. You know, I've only been thinking in this space for about the same amount of time as Symphony, maybe a year and a half, possibly 2 years, somewhere in there. And my interest really grew out of it based on a reading group called Algorithms as Artifacts that Cliff Anderson here at Vanderbilt, in coordination with the Vanderbilt Institute for Digital Learning, started. And it was a reading and discussion group that focused on the kind of myriad of ways that algorithms are operative in our lives and the various social and ethical implications of that. Around the same time, I was, you know, thinking a lot and of some criticism that I was developing about the role of social media in the scholarly communications environment. And I've really been kind of exploring that intersection ever since, of which, you know, privacy is pretty much a fundamental pillar. So start a reading group and a discussion group and reach out to your colleagues.
All really great advice. And I will echo that Sarah and I will nerd out about privacy all day with anyone who's willing to listen and talk with us. All right, so thank you. Turning to Claire again, how do you maintain current awareness of privacy-related issues?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Well, getting back to Library Freedom Institute, one of the main ways that I keep on top of this stuff is like following all the people who came to speak at LFI on Twitter. All of the Library Freedom Institute lectures are available for anyone to watch on Vimeo. They're open to the public, and there's some amazing people on there. And I would say that's the first way. I keep just a little like ongoing PowerPoint for myself that I call my compendium of creepy things, where like it's like all of like the worst news stories about like various surveillance and data breaches and stuff, and it's like stuff that I like can drop into presentations. There's a lot of good. I would think the Vice Motherboard does a lot of their coverage of privacy and surveillance issues is good. I like the Reply All podcast. And then we have like a little LFI text thread where people are always sending out stuff, and that's also super helpful, but that also a lot of times gets shared on Twitter as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I like a lot of the series that you mentioned. Sarah and I have a current awareness tab in our toolkit, and we have a lot of series that people can follow and maintain current awareness.
I just thought of one more thing too. So there's a really good, I'm just saying LFI all the time, but there's a Library Freedom Institute suggested reading list with a lot of great books on it. Like, actually I have one of them that I'm reading right now, Race After Technology by Ruha Benjamin. There's a whole long list. I can put the link into that in the chat, but yeah, lots of awesome books about these topics.
Yes, agreed. I have that one on my bookshelf too. And then Symphony, did you have anything additional to add with staying current?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm embarrassed for you to know how much time I spend on Twitter, but it is true that I'm there a lot, and I follow a lot of privacy people. I don't know how else, people whose either their research, their advocacy, their writing sort of revolves around privacy, and sort of amassing this group of people to follow on Twitter has been has been really organic. Like, find one person who seems to have a really strong voice, and follow the people whom they retweet, and follow the people whom they're linking to, and the articles that they're sharing. But that has introduced me to so many different thinkers and researchers and advocates outside of academia. And I think that that's been really important. Like folks at the Media Justice Center, Black-led organization, working on surveillance issues regarding the surveillance state and the carceral system. Finding folks like that who are working on surveillance and privacy issues outside of academia has made sure that my awareness is really holistic, and I feel pretty rich. And so that's been really helpful and really important. But also, following, journalists, obviously, who are keeping a pulse on things, like April Glaser, for example, wrote for Slate and currently writing for NBC. Those things have been really, really helpful for keeping track. And obviously, like Claire said, we do have a really great network of folks to learn from.
Awesome, thank you for sharing. One instance where I will admit the algorithm works in your favor. So, all right, so speaking of current events and staying current, I'm going to turn to Andy, but how have current events, so remote teaching and learning practices like online proctoring, contact tracing, protests, etc., influenced or inspired your privacy literacy teaching approach?
Yeah, thanks. So I think it was Sarah towards the beginning kind of alluded to this differentiation in privacy literacy between like techno-solutionism and then understanding kind of cultural practices. And I think that's really kind of come to the fore, at least in Melissa and my fellowship this semester. Like the pandemic obviously has influenced our approach to teaching, as I'm sure it has for all of you. We moved into this remote environment in the spring and we continued remotely to this fall. But it does feel weird to hold like a privacy fellowship over Zoom and then to rely on Brightspace as well. However, like this environment affords us two opportunities. One, to explore some techno-solutionist tools that we can kind of work around them. But I think also the pandemic and the degree to which so much of our lives has moved into online spaces has also really laid bare the kind of hegemony of surveillance architecture that's funding these online environments. So it gives us the opportunity to talk more about that in a very clear way. So just a couple of ways that we address this in our class. Like again, we have placed kind of an emphasis on privacy tools and how we use them. So like, I think we held one class in Jitsi and we've encouraged our students to use Jitsi for all of their personal calls. Jitsi is an open source video conferencing service that works very well as browser-based. We've also encouraged the use of things like CryptPad, which is basically like Google Drive, except on an encrypted server for collaborative work. And then we started a group chat in Signal for our class to kind of familiarize students with encrypted messaging applications. But again, like that's kind of the techno-solutionist side. We also looked at how we contrast these individual approaches, again, with the kind of hegemony of surveillance architecture. Because while we criticize Zoom and we criticize Brightspace, we're still using it. And despite our desire to protect our privacy, in the 21st century, particularly during a shelter-in-place pandemic period, it's really difficult to escape kind of all of these digital tools and services because they're very much enabling us to continue to live in this way.
Thank you so much for all of that. That was very interesting. And yes, we struggle with that balance as well. So Claire, did you have anything that you wanted to add for this question?
Sure, yeah. I would say one of the small ways that current events impacts my teaching of this, I think, for better or worse, there's so much going on right now that it's really easy to use like privacy related examples from current events in teaching that's not explicitly about privacy. So for example, like I was working with an English 101 class recently and, you know, talking about developing a topic into a research question, into a thesis statement, and like coming up with a outline of how to, you know, write a paper. And the example I gave is like the stuff related to facial recognition technology in policing and how that disproportionately misidentifies people of color, and you know, brought in like some of the there was a study that ACRL did a year or two ago with like the faces of people, members of Congress, through this like Amazon recognition software. Anyways, like giving that as an example, I think there's ways to like work this stuff into other types of teaching that aren't explicitly, you know, that's not explicitly a privacy workshop. And, you know, for better or worse, there's like enough dystopia out there right now that like you can always find those. I think, you know, in the all remote environment, or almost all remote, because I'm actually on campus today, even though like no one else is, we did some professional development at the beginning of the summer for faculty who were going to be teaching remotely, and you know, had a module in there about just about like privacy, but also like letting your students know what you can see, like letting them know a little bit like what Moodle shows you, so that they kind of are able to be informed users of this educational technology that they're forced to interact with.
Thank you. And yeah, we always like to pull the curtain back on the educational technologies that students have to, you know, they're obligated to use as students. All right, and so our final question for our panelists, and I'm going to turn back to Andy again, but where do you see privacy literacy instruction going next? And what is your sense of librarianship's handling of privacy literacy?
Sure, thanks. So I think it may have been Symphony earlier that said that basically privacy literacy is information literacy, which I think is a hugely important point, and one that we ought to keep in mind. But I'm going to focus a little bit more on librarianship's handling of privacy literacy, I think. So I think in the United States, at least, we have an occasionally healthy skepticism towards government power, but we oftentimes fail to recognize threats inherent in cultural and economic logics. And I think privacy literacy in librarianship reflects this. I think we've been good, and generally we've been good in libraries about raising awareness of like government censorship and surveillance. But I don't know that we've been as good about addressing privacy threats inherent in an information ecosystem whose revenue models depend on surveillance architecture, data profiling, and the manipulation of persons towards generation of profit. And to me, I think that that's a real gap that's missing, not just in libraries, but in our society in general. And it's one that I think libraries are well positioned to fill. But I'll also add that I think privacy literacy needs to go hand in hand with privacy advocacy. And we've kind of alluded to this a little bit throughout the talk. I think like we can raise awareness of privacy threats and provide assistance in like digital self-defense through cleaning out data profiles, minimizing the use of smartphones or technology like Tor to access the internet privately. However, I'm not convinced that it's ultimately a reasonable solution to kind of push privacy protection down to the individual level. And so we really need to also be advocating for more robust regulatory environments of our information ecosystem, so that those that hold power are responsible for protecting the privacy of the individual. That responsibility isn't just placed onto the individual. And you know, I'll go back to Zuboff, you know, who wrote The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which many of you in this room may have read. That certainly really threw gasoline on the fire of my interest in this privacy work. But you know, Zuboff is basically of the opinion that like markets that are run on data gathering, analysis, and sale basically should be outlawed. You know, she thinks that like it's a fundamentally flawed market due to the types of manipulation that it pushes down to the individual level. And she likens it, in fact, to something like, you know, we ban markets in organ trafficking, for example, because she recognizes that as being a fundamentally harmful market and one that just shouldn't exist. And she applies that same logic to the market of collecting and selling data as well. So I'm more in that boat that we need to do more advocacy work along with our literacy work, because I think any impactful change has to come from higher levels.
Absolutely, and thank you so much. I think that really fits into what Sarah and I try to do with it being a value before a technology, because if students value their privacy and really understand it on a more personal level, I think they'll be more likely to be advocates than if we leave them with tools that they can think they can go off and then they're safe online. So I think for the sake of time, we need to move on to Q&A, but thank you so much for sharing all of your experiences and your expertise to all of our panelists. That was wonderful. We don't probably have time for our participant discussion, although while we're answering Q&A, we can send you our Padlets so you can answer some of these questions and interact as we're answering Q&As. I'm sure Sarah is dropping a link in there. So all of our questions, if you'd like to respond, are in here and you can add your responses. But let's move on to Q&A. I haven't been looking.
So I think Symphony and I have been trying to answer them over text, but I'll throw out a couple to
Thank
the
you.
that I didn't feel qualified to address. So one attendee asks, are any of you instructors of record that gives you the freedom to teach this? Or are there ways to make this a requirement for students? Or are you offering this as bonus and optional learning for students? And do you find faculty are frequently surprisingly ignorant about privacy?
I can jump into this one if you'd like. So part of my work and work with one of my really amazing colleagues, Gwendolyn, is that we're trying to do sort of like a top-down approach while at the same time doing this sort of piecemeal bottom-up approach. So the first answer is no, there is nothing in our curriculum that makes space for privacy literacy, but there is a whole lot of space for information literacy in our general education program. So I think that gives me the personal space to do whatever I want to do in the classroom. I don't usually ever ask for instructors' permission when I'm searching for and sneaking in and finding those pockets where I can weave privacy literacy instruction into my information literacy instruction. But we are also trying to work from the top up. So we are trying to get to our provost and to our deans and those sorts of levels of folks to create a body that could help our faculty and our staff and our students sort of handle these sort of privacy and surveillance conundrums at an institutional level, which I think goes to what Andy was saying about advocacy work. We definitely need to be involved in advocacy work at our local, regional, and federal government levels, but also at our own institutions in creating a climate and culture of talking about privacy. My faculty have said to me that they don't feel comfortable providing suggestions to students or making informed decisions. And they need this training as much as our students, maybe even more, because they are the ones who are assigning technologies and things like that for students to use.
I can also jump in. So it's not a central part of the core curriculum here. One thing, I've done a decent amount of professional development for faculty and staff at my campus, and then also some jointly with our IT department. Me and a member of IT did like an information security workshop for faculty and staff. And out of that, I had a few different requests from faculty members to come to their classes. We have this Don't Cancel That Class program which only happens like when we're actually in person, but where faculty know that they need to be away for some reason, they can request an instructor come do a workshop with their class. And so I have this digital privacy workshop that I offer for that. And after doing the professional development stuff, I got a bunch of requests for that specific workshop. And a lot came out of that.
And our work has all been kind of additional bonus for students as well. So the fellowships that we've been running are an add-on. They're not part of like curriculum. And in addition to that, I've been trying to explore some of the merging of information literacy and this type of privacy work. So we hosted 2 workshop series last semester, which again were add-ons, and they were concurrent and complementary. One focusing on research productivity, which is more kind of traditional information literacy space. The other focusing on digital literacy, which had a very strong privacy and ethics component. And those 2 series kind of, again, were building off of each other over the course of a semester. But we're not, the faculty of record for courses.
Alex and I are also not instructors of record. So ours is, we try to partner a lot with campus partnerships, which you can see listed in the Q&A. Alex has done a lot of work to integrate us into that first year experience programming. And then those workshops students can use them for credit towards their first year experience programming. So that's how we're sneaking it in. We had a couple of questions come up about sort of vendor contracts and library assessment. So I thought I might lump those together for our panelists and ask, have you undertaken any kind of privacy literacy work with your peer colleagues? Or do you have any experience working with either internal assessment issues or any influence in vendor contract negotiations where you might be able to address concerns about privacy right from the outset and privacy by design, right, in terms of contract negotiations?
No, but now I'm embarrassed, so perhaps I should.
So part of the work on our campus of sort of getting at the provost level and folks who are making decisions at that level is to make a case for a privacy audit to happen, not only within the library, but also sort of in all departments and all colleges across our campus. To get the funding for that, it takes people obviously to do this work, so to get the labor for that. But there's work, and I can't think of people's names right now. Becky Use, for example, does a ton of webinars and things like that about how to go about doing privacy audits within your libraries. And I would definitely look into that work. But that's the point where we are at in my library, is advocating for the time and the funds to do that work. And it's been taking a while.
So I think we're coming up on time, and as much as I would talk about this forever, I want to make sure that we turn back to the committee and make sure there isn't any housekeeping that they need to do in this last minute.
Thank you. That was great. I just want to thank our moderators, Alex and Sarah, and our panelists, Symphony, Andy, and Claire. So we'll give them a virtual round of applause. I know you can only hear me. But thank you so much for that great presentation and for sharing all those resources. And thank you to ACRL for providing us this wonderful webinar space to do this. And as mentioned, a recording of this will be sent out in the next couple of days. So everyone who registered will get a recording. And as mentioned, some of the moderators and panelists had said that they're willing to take follow-up questions. So thank you everyone for attending. I think we're out of time, and let's go ahead and stop the recording. Thanks.